Hello everyone, welcome once again to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I am Patrick, and today we're going over kind of some of the books that I've read for 2024. I do these lists kind of every year to give Tony and myself a little bit more time during those busy months that we have, where people tend to focus less on the podcasts that are in their lives and more on their family time, which is very appropriate. And this just gives me a chance to kind of look back and share my reviews of the books that I read. But this year, 2024, I read 42 books, and I was very autobiography or biography heavy than I usually am this year, which was an odd thing for me. But you'll also find a few smatterings of different, very young novels in here. That's because I'm reading these alongside my children, or my children are reading them with me. So we have to review even those books, because not all of them are good as well. And of course, the mixture of both weird sci-fi, both old and new, and also, of course, our theology. I will say that in comparison with traditional publishing and the glorious indie community that I've kind of globbed myself onto a little bit more, won the year this year, and so I plan to highlight those a little bit more too as we go through this list. So if this is an episode that you want to skip because you don't care, that's fine, but all these clips will be broken out into their individual reviews and posted. And also, they'll be posted on where I usually put out my reviews, which are Goodreads, Amazon, and Library Thing. Also, they'll all be on caveofthecross.com to check out, and I make little thumbnails for them, and you can click them within the whole scope of them, of the page right there, book reviews, and from there you can find the individual book review posted as well. The Love and Respect Devotional, 52 Weeks to Experience Love and Respect in Your Marriage by Emerson, Eggerichs. Overview. Eggerichs surveyed thousands of couples to develop 52 devotionals around the three cycles that are at the heart of love and respect. Review. A devotional for married couples is hard to get right. You're talking to two people, and you're looking to make applications for people all through the spectrum of marriage highs and lows. With this book, it feels like most of it's talking to people only in the lows. The first month is pretty much talking to people who only bought the devotional as the we need help rather than a couple wanting biblically based marriage devotional. So this tends to skew more in the self-help category than in the devotional category. It also skews more as a sales pitch to kind of the system and other books from the author. Now, he does offer a summary of his book, of his system, and at the back of the book, you can kind of read it without having to purchase the other book. But the implication is that the other books are what's being pointed to strongly here. When you spend the first section of your book talking about husbands shouldn't view this as a thing to dread, but then make a good portion of the first part of the devotion of what you were warning against, kind of good luck getting men on board. For a devotional, this is too inward focused and not enough. Not that I'm saying it's fully lacking, but it tends to be more inward focus and then an upward focus, Godward perspective. Final grade, D. Deathbringer by Blake Carpenter. Overview. This one's an Indiepub. Inga is a sword bearer. Women who inherit a magical weapon called Deathbringer. She's murdered on her wedding day by a noblewoman who steals the sword after killing Inga and her whole family. The sword brings Inga back to life, but only for a week. The clock is ticking for Inga to reunite with the sword before she's dead. Overview. I have a hard time liking fantasy for the most part, but having read Carpenter's story in Periapsis Christmas 2, a masterful story that I would love to read anything from an expanded story of that one, I wanted to pick up anything by him, and he did not disappoint with Deathbringer. A darker world with elements of magic, but also the technology of trains and firearms. This isn't steampunk per se, but those mid-19th, 20th century aesthetics elements are there. A matriarchal society is in place, but these aren't women who act like men. There are women who are highborn, noble leaders who are hardened under the stress of ruling and leadership, something that we would find in a world ruled like that. All characters are well motivated and actions are believable to their personalities. Crazy, I know. There is no worry about reading about overpowered boss babes who hate men with politics of current day. They live and exist and act in the world that they have been established in. Now, Carpenter writes the characters that you care about the story of each one, even the bad guys. I mean, ladies. Our main character, Inga, has a great story arc. She loves a betrothed, and when she experiences loss, she maintains that feeling as a real person would, thinking back to it, longing for it, thinking about what might have happened. She doesn't shake it off and move to the main male lead, Cale. She loves with a love of someone who is a young married and also experiences thoughts of revenge of someone thrust into from a small world she's accustomed to a much wider world and a metaphysical reality as well. Cale, the male character here, also is experiencing a change, is accustomed to reality, and his story of sexual assault in a matriarchal society establishes a great motivation and psychological damage that makes him sympathetic to the reader, although I wasn't fully convinced until much later in the story that he could be trusted. That's probably more says about me than about the author here. The main bad character is a great opposing force to our main lead. Her mother is also a great read, and any moments reading her were tense and also understandable. As for the plot, Carpenter establishes well and sets off on the journey well. About 20% of the start of the journey has a little to desire in terms of pacing. It's not bad by any means, just a different pace. I was a little leery at first with the idea of a talking sword, telepathically, and there was a power that's critical to the story that seems to be bestowed on Inga a little too conveniently, but having it come up a little at a time through the journey section would have added to a more established turn of action. Now, the story moves so phenomenally well in the later part of the book. From the city to the end is nothing but greatness. I'll also say that it is so difficult to convey fighting scenes to where it's not just a collection of punches or anime speeches between big moves. Not so the case here. Fights have weights and enough writing to make them action-based, but not every swipe of the sword or bullet fired has to be talked about. It seems clear that Carpenter seems to have some familiarity with combat fighting, especially with bladed weapons. And Carpenter has built the tension, and he lets you have moments of breath before it rises again. I do have to say, I did end up gasping literally in one moment of one of the final scenes, so I was invested thoroughly. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book and Carpenter's characters and writing. There's no getting bogged down in a long family lines, and there's a world built where there's enough detail given to you to know that you need, but there's more to explore. I will not only continue the series, but we'll be picking up pretty much anything else Carpenter has out there. It was a great way to kick off 2024. Final grade, A. All Systems Red by Martha Wells. Overview. On a distant planet, a team of scientists is conducting surface tests shadowed by their company-supplied droid, a self-aware robot that refers to itself as Murderbot. All Murderbot wants to be is left alone long enough to watch some TV. But those pesky humans keep finding themselves in trouble, and Murderbot has to actually do its job. Review. With a character that is described as a robot who refers to itself as a Murderbot sarcastically, and who has a lot of hidden liberty, it sounds like it would lead to a fun story. Unfortunately, there isn't just too much of substance to the story. This book was so dull for me that I forgot that I had reviewed it. I didn't remember that I read it. I read the book again, and then I was surprised when I found my own review that I really agreed with from 6 years before. I didn't realize I'd already read the book and reviewed it. Murderbot only gets interesting once it reveals itself to some humans about halfway through the book, and even then, it's pretty tame. The plot isn't terrible, but it's definitely lackluster. With other robots like Star Wars HK-47 or Bender from Futurama, there are better foils out there, and I won't be continuing the series, and I wouldn't suggest it to others. Final grade, D. Redeemed by Blood, Shannon Baker. Overview. An old man decides to be a good Samaritan to a stranger who has been tortured and left for dead on the side of the road. The stranger lets him know the old man could be in danger and the stranger isn't someone worth saving. But the old man sees some good in him and to value doing the right thing over being safe. Review. Another Indiepub. This was a nice and complete short story with a fully fleshed out set of characters and story arc. John, the old man and main character, is a character to quickly be endeared to. His stalwart faith and down-to-earth nature are the story's biggest driving forces. Samson, whom John essentially rescues from death, is in a Good Samaritan parallel and is the outsider who brings the greater threat from outside world to John's doorsteps in the form of a biker gang Samson stood up against. The plot follows learning about the two men as they learn about each other, and John learns about Samson standing up and being kicked out of his biker crew, and Samson's learning about what makes John someone to rescue a bad dude from death but not turn him into the police. John's Christian faith is in focus through the story without a doubt and culminates in confrontation with evil. Some readers of Christian fiction will enjoy the familiar plot beats seen in other books. Also, there are good action scenes without gratuitous violence for the sake of violence. With the understanding that this is a short story, it would have been valuable to see more characterization of Samson and his growth or change. And without spoilers, a big character change does seem to happen quickly because the story is coming to a climax and an end. John also tells Samson the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think it would have been better for the audience to put that together, or maybe for Samson to discover the parallel himself, if the author wanted to make that clear to the audience. The straightforward nature of the story is there for the purpose of focusing mainly on the two men. A few more details and a bit more subtlety would have been preferred, but it's good. Simple story, and to enjoy in less than 100 pages. Final grade, B. Defeating Evil, How God Glorifies Himself in the Dark World, Scott Christensen. Overview. Revised, adapted, and condensed for a broader audience, this companion edition to Scott Christensen's lauded What About Evil shows how sin, evil, corruption, and death fit into redemptive history. Exploring the storyline of Scripture and addressing practical concerns, Christensen shows that God's ultimate end in creation is to maximize His glory before His image bearers by defeating evil through Christ's atoning work. Review. Now, much of this review will parallel the review of the longer book, What About Evil? With defeating evil, Christensen has streamlined his argument while keeping a great deal of what was made in What About Evil? My top recommendation for Theodicy, and one that has personally impacted me and my sanctification after reading it. Christensen does deal with other argumentation, but boils down the Reformed Arminian distinction to a few of the key distinctions. Where this book shines is what was the biggest surprise to me when reading What About Evil, its focus on why this is a theodicy, a reason for, and not just a defense of evil. The big focus on the theodicy being the means by which we see in Romans 9 why God allows for evil to take place, to focus on the glory of God in the fullness of Revelation. While I do think the book loses some of the biggest apologetics in both theodicy and defense, I don't think it suffers. It allows a certain group of readers who are maybe apprehensive of reading an 800-page book, but the message about the glory of God seen in all areas of life in this 300-page book is still useful and impactful. This is a book I would recommend to my friends at church while recommending them to check out where I went through What About Evil on GiveTheCross.com. Final grade, A. Lost and Found by Robert E. Kearns. In Ireland, Liam Doone comes across what might be a flying saucer, but certain people don't want him to remember what he saw, and Liam finds himself not remembering anything and missing that period of time. In Washington, D.C., Lester Stevens has come back to his old boss telling him he doesn't have any memory of his time of accepting a secret position inside the Pentagon. Both men's worlds collide and they begin to suffer from bad dreams. Both men work to find out what happened to them and what they saw. Review. Another Indiepub here. This started out pretty well in good familiar territory, mixing in some elements of an X-Files plotline of a man, Liam Doone, at the wrong place at the wrong time, of meeting U.S. government agents, recovering a crashed flying saucer. Doone meets a Man in Black type character, which is actually Lester Stevens, who is a rookie at the job and doesn't have the heart to do what's asked of him by the military men in charge. What occurs is a plotline that doesn't really go anywhere and is hindered by some unnecessary flashbacks during the unfolding of no real tension being built. Doone and Stevens undergo the same drug and operations scenario to make them think that alien abductions happened to them to cover up for the U.S. military involvement in the recovery of crashed UFOs. There is some solid basis for a good story on that. Having Stevens' story about how he joined the program and left is done during the time when Stevens has that lost memory. This should have been done right after Doone being dropped back off after being abducted, and should have been uncovered by Stevens under hypnosis, which is where the story uses. But this going back and forth between his story and we kind of already know just with more detail about what's really happening under the Pentagon, and him trying to figure out what is happening to him doesn't really make any sense. Dune takes a big back seat in the story and is only there to push Stephen's storyline. Stevens has it easy, though, through this. His boss believes him, the authorities believe him, his therapist believes him, he has some trouble sleeping and drinking more, but he recognizes this and gets help. There are a couple of interesting investigation moments, but he quickly takes a back seat for the inspecting authorities to take over. He's in the military, but doesn't act like it, and all he's really threatened with is some violation of an NDA disclosure agreement he doesn't remember signing. Not really the big, scary secret organization keeping the largest findings in human history under wraps for the past 70 years. The ending is pretty blasé. It takes the safe ending, and there's kind of a stupid scene with an alien with a knife to take care of a person who screwed up. It's all just a kind of jumbled mess and deflated in any tension or imagination. Final grade, D. After Moses by Michael F. Kane. Space cowboy Matthew Cole freelances around the solar system for jobs that allow him to work solo and ethically, a hard mix to find. After a job gone sideways, Cole begins to be open to having a crew and doing jobs that are still ethical, but might cause his loner heart to unthaw. Operating in a future where Moses, an AI construct, once helped mankind, it one day vanished without a trace or reason given. Cole and the rest of humanity operate in a world benefiting from the work of Moses, but how long can that last? Can an ethical cowboy freelancer and his ragtag crew survive in a harsh universe? Review. Another win for Indiepub. I absolutely enjoyed this book immensely. I was about halfway through the first book when I ordered all the other books in the series in hardcover. It was a joy and pleasure to read the story. The plot, the characters, the setting were so well thought out and unfolding to always keep me interested. Here's my early complaint. You get too much story for what little you paid for this. Kane should have gotten at least 4 books out of this and charged you and me the same price for all of them. Now, with my tongue-in-cheek complaint out of the way, the adventures of the crew are very episodic in nature, and each one matches a familiar pattern of a serial without the old-time cheese. They are self-contained adventures. Here's the kicker. You can enjoy them without needing to read 8 books with a never-ending sword of Damocles hanging as the big bad. That is not to say that there isn't an overarching story in the universe. It is tastefully teased out as narrative interviews at the beginning of the chapters, and save one that differs as an important to the story, and peppered throughout the adventures of the crew. This is so smart and just downright enjoyable. I will say that it would have been nice to have just a little bit more understanding of what Moses did for humanity in terms of care and technology. The subtlety gets a little too much and overshadows some of the payout towards the end of the book. A small gripe. The characters could not have been written any better. The main character, Matthew Cole, is a likable and a mixture of a mysterious past, a hero paragon, and someone who can change when the situation calls for it. And it makes him so well-rounded, you almost forget that it's okay for authors to still do this. The crew collected along the way do not fade into the background. Each one is written like an actual human being you want to read about. In fact, some of the crew have some of the best lines written about them. Yvonne has an amazing character moment in a library that is subtle but very powerful and advances her character, maybe a little bit more than our main character for a good purpose. The children characters, Grace and Davy, are just annoying enough to make you believe they are children, but they are able to grow and have purpose as the story progresses. Abigail, as the Shield Maiden co-bounty hunter, also has virtue and poise and agency and growth. I like that, at least in this book, there is no need to push a romantic angle with Cole. She does not take a back seat, only backs up where is needed, and works well in a team setting. Again, the plot are the stories, and there are stories upon stories upon stories here. Each chapter is a self-contained adventure, and so you get rise and fall tension and action and periods of rest. However, where a good roller coaster puts the big drop at the beginning of the ride, the end story has the best rising and falling action. Kane bought a lot of favor with his audience with all the other stories and gave them a wallop of one at the end. There is not one bad one in this bunch. There are none that don't have a purpose or fail to logically follow where our characters are as people or from their talents. This is just good sci-fi straight through. And yes, the Firefly comparison is probably appropriate in terms of setting and feel, but this is so different in such a good way, and we get more than one season and a movie here. The ending is nice as a setup for other books in the series, but you can easily be done with this one and just know that the world exists in the book that goes on. That's what I want when it comes to any sci-fi fantasy book, and I'm happy that this story has other parts. This is a high recommendation for me, and I'm going to say that will probably be hard one to beat in 2024 as the book I love completely. I cannot say enough good things about this and recommend just buying all the books in the series straight out. A true joy. Final grade, A+. The Button Girl by Sally Apokedak. Overview. Repentance Atwater just turned 16 years old and by law, button or marry a village boy so that the offspring they produce in their swamp village can become slaves for the ruling kingdom. Repentance shocks everyone by refusing to button, and now her and her fiancé must become slaves themselves. This is all according to plan because Repentance wants to go into the kingdom to save her siblings that have already been sold into slavery. But someone has other plans, the king himself. Review. Another Indiepub. This was a decent young adult fantasy novel where Repentance Atwater decides to choose slavery over watching her and her family continue the cycle of birthing children to eventually give over to the rulers as slaves. The broader world unfolds some as we follow the exploits of our main character, and it seems like the world is built on the backs of slaves and slave economy in the world of kings and kingdoms. Atwater finds herself in the very halls of the king as his concubine, but something is amiss, and what she has learned about history doesn't quite match up with the older man who won't take his privilege with her. The king educates her, and she finds herself in the midst of a regicide plot involving the prince. As a character, Repentance is fairly likable. Her plan involves a lot of naivete, which matches her starting character. It wasn't overall clear if her purpose involved finding her stolen brothers or to be subject to slavery to break the cycle of children production for the slavers. Her relationship with the one who she refuses to marry, Sober Marsh, adds to her naivete as she essentially condemns him to her fate as well. As we are not told if she has a plan or Sober deserves the same fate, this doesn't exactly endear us to her right away. It is possible I don't know young adult girls enough, but her character seems to flip-flop between weepy damsel, who believes all hope is lost from the get-go, to being insolent and headstrong. This doesn't go towards a lot of character growth, and her relationships she forms and the people she interacts with tend to fluctuate between these two character traits. I also tend not to buy her change in feeling towards another character, and it seems more like a switch that's flipped. That's the same switch seems to be flipped too quickly in that character as well. The setting and the plot offer a lot to explore. Not everything is revealed, and outside this one kingdom, a lot is kept out of view to focus on Repentance's world. There are mentions of other kingdoms, and interestingly enough, there is a mention of a type of god, and it would have been nice to have found more details about this and whether Repentance follows him or if it's just ingrained in her and other slaves due to propaganda. How people are named as well seems to indicate there is something to that as well, at least for the slaves. There are other parts of the setting which aren't quite clear enough, including different types of materials used in what appears to be an ice-centric kingdom. She lives in one in which elements can be controlled in some fashion. The plot kept me interested, although it does take a good amount of the book to really get going. The bigger plot tends to be considered by Repentance with some leaps in logic to stop the bad guy from the bad guy plot. It concludes well, and I enjoyed my reading experience with the story. Just as a side note, I have the original cover rather than the updated one, and I would say both don't really fit with the tone of the book, but that is a minor grievance. Final grade, B-. A Case of Conscience by James Blish. Overview. The citizens of planet Lithia are some of the most ethical, sentient beings ever found. Priest Ramon Ruiz Sanchez is on the planet of Lithia, where lizard-like creatures exist in complete harmony and devoid of what seems to Father Ramon of original sin. This scares the priest, who recommends with some others on his team that humanity should remove itself from contact with the planet for the sake of humanity's very soul. Review. I always give Blish credit for including religion in early sci-fi. For the non-establishment genre at the time, it had a lot of gatekeepers who just assumed religion would be phased out in the future, humanity would continue to evolve, but smoking and radio would never change. Blish seems to include a Jesuit priest here, not for anything Jesuit-like, but it seems he knows the Jesuits have a history of being learned men, and so would fit in with an expedition of possible colonization. This book is of two parts in a couple of ways. And the first is the expedition and the revelation, which was pretty bloody interesting. and something a lot different from what I was expecting, which was, oh, this planet is actually Eden with lizards. So that was a great surprise when that wasn't it, and that was far from it. The second part is the kind of fish, or I guess lizard out of water being on Earth section. While there is some great early 1950s ideas of what the future would look like, it really meanders and is weaker in the storytelling, and a change in tone that kind of throws you out of the story after a decent reveal. The ending also falls into a weak and very quickly conclusion that doesn't borrow from the good parts of the story, first half of the story. I did overall like this, and the shorter aspect of it would make me recommend it to the right person. I also think this would be a good writing prompt someone could pick up with or continue from the idea, like we've seen with Arthur C. Clarke's A Meeting with Medusa. Great revelation, weak concluding, execution, final grade, C+. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. Overview. The story follows a runaway teenager called the Kid who becomes entangled with the brutal Glanton gang, a group of scalp hunters operating along the Texas border in the mid-19th century. The Kid encounters the sadistic leader of the gang known as the Judge as they engage in violent acts against Native Americans and other groups in the area. There is something otherworldly about the Judge, and closeness of death of their adventure at every set of the turn sets the stage for an intriguing read. Review. Now, I love The Road. I think it is absolutely one of the best books to hurt you with depression, and yet, there is hope. McCarthy's writing always has some touch of that, and Blood Meridian does well there as well. This was an earlier novel of McCarthy, and one not well received in 1985, which is to be expected. In the 80s, you probably didn't have the nihilism of today from the mainstream thought, whereas today the book wouldn't work well because of the bad words being the most offensive part of the book. McCarthy definitely pulls from Paradise Lost and Heart of Darkness. Especially with Milton, I see why people want a backstory to why Satan did what he did. However, when I hear the story, my questions are to why God did what he did. The fallen state of man makes Satan too relatable a character. I want to know what the alien mind thinks and why. McCarthy is never not going to be a talented writer. I may have found this book more middle of the road, but that's mostly due to what the author attempted to do with the theme and plot, and not with the talent and phrase. There is some great moments of the story, and those exist mostly in the subtlety of letting the reader draw conclusions that could be debated among superfans. Some good speeches and dialogue by the Judge, and some clear references to Prometheus and Paradise Lost story elements are very enjoyable here. The Judge will probably be on a number of lists for the greatest villains in media, and he's clearly a personification of the devil or evil, but I think he also portrays the flaws with McCarthy's story. The Judge, like the story, relies too much on man is ultimately evil, and while the boy can be read as taking part in the evil or not, this type of story never highlights the other side of the meta-narrative. If there is a devil, then there is a God, and the devil is God's devil. This aspect is what made The Road so amazing, that hope could be found where none should exist, and anything that did at the time was burned up. Unless if you have the boy take no part in any of the violence, which is hard to make that argument, the ending only works if he remained pure and then gave up. All this to say that it doesn't offer the reader, who can read the ultra-violent racism, some good storytelling here. Maybe in 1985 there wasn't enough, yeah, but what's the devil side of the story? And I'm just burned out of the villain is the person to root for, grim dark from those of less talent than McCarthy. I'll leave Blood Meridian and take The Road out. Final grade, B-. All These Worlds by Dennis E. Taylor, Book 3 of the Bobbyverse. Overview. Book 3 of the Bobbyverse continues the tale of Bob and his clones as they try to save humanity and the rest of the galaxy from the others, and from not having enough fun and excitement. Review. This is the conclusion to many of the storylines from the first two books. The quality of the writing continues and has grown to an almost literal full universe created by Taylor. While there are many different threads that have been talked about from the four main Bobs, they are the focus in the story. The conclusion of the Eden-Archimedes storyline is a good capping and a bittersweet that shows the main Bob has come a good long ways from the human Bob in Vegas. Although ironically, this Bob seems the most out of it of the overarching storylines. The Others War is where the main thrust of the book, and it's all the space shooting and thinking that you want from this opera. The quest to save humanity and now the colonies are also set up and concluded well. I have to say that the love story with Howard, Bob, and Bridget is one that doesn't quite work, or at least left a lot on the table. If Howard had discussed more about what the changes to Bridget would be and how he had solved the problems from his earlier days, this would have added more to the story. Overall, the action, science fiction, space exploration, good logic, and of course the humor continue to be a stable storytelling element, and Taylor writes them well. The conclusion was also a nice end with the Bobs that set out the next storyline, but also adds tension, but with some cool-headed logic. That should be expected from the Bobs. Final grade, A. Hacking Galileo by Fenton Wood. Overview. A first-hand account of a group of hackers in the 80s who discover alien life and save the planet, and no one knew it even happened until now. Review. Another Indiepub. Back to the early days of the internet in the late 90s, 2000s, you had a number of stories you'd come across where there was a hacker base that had just enough technology, but didn't skimp out on the fiction to make the story interesting. Some of these book titles have been lost to the memory and time, but they're stories I remember reading. And Hacking Galileo was remembering these stories and adding good old nerd indie writing to the mix. This book is not going to be for everyone, and Wood has done a lot of homework, and the science and the tech of the late 80s of telephony, computers, ham radio, astrophysics are there. Homages to the early OG hackers like Kevin Mitnick, 2600, and others are scattered throughout. This is like Stranger Things, but with nerdier people and less running around with monsters. On one hand, many of these characters are too smart and too good at what they do, especially in high school, to be real. But again, I harken back to the days of reading hacker fanfiction, and this is right up there with all the characters I love to read about. I will say that the main character who is telling the story tends to get lost in the story a little. He's there, of course, and he helps to do things that he has some skill for, not being noticed, but that seems to be it. He might add details, but the other characters are doing the heavy lifting in the team. The book is also written by the main character, and the indie author gets away with the amateur look and font of the chapters, because it makes it out like one of the self-published conspiracy books you'd buy from a guy at the table by the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas. It just adds a lot to the story and the feeling of reading it. The excess of chapters also makes the book read very quickly. There are parts where you suspend your disbelief when it comes not to just the characters, but to the plot. Going to Russia and acceptance to different groups that puts our characters on the right path is just a part of the fun. There are a couple of chapters in there where it switches to this attempt to parallel the story with a fantasy novel a friend was working on, and I just kind of hated that shift. But it's just a few pages and is done after that. The conclusion was a bit mixed, but overall, the renegades of society against the man, the system, the Fed boys, the world, I really liked that a lot. And it was a lot of fun to read with this book. This was nostalgia done right. Final grade, A. Timothy of the 10th Floor by Jenny Phillips. Overview. 11-year-old Timothy Todd lives happily with his dad on the 10th floor of the Bedford Apartments building. That is, until Timothy's cousin Zoe and her grandmother Annabelle come to live with them. Timothy isn't thrilled about giving up his room or sharing his life with people he barely remembers, but he soon learns how much this homeschooled girl and her loving grandmother will change his life. Review. Co-read with my 8-year-old daughter, this book offers a mix of challenging words for an improving reader and switches about every 2 times a chapter between parent and child on sections to read. That has to be a unique thread to try and weave for an author, and Phillips does well enough to provide a good little mystery, emotion, and character development. While Timothy is the title character and covers some internal dialogue of his, and not anyone else's, his cousin Zoe is an equal co-star to the story as well. While her character doesn't have the same arc Timothy does, she's a good character that leads him on his journey. There are some sweet moments and even some very well-done sad moments that add to the fact that this story about a Christian homeschoolers who are maybe a little too good, it doesn't have to always have a story where everything always works out in the way you think it will. The moral of the story, not that there is only one, but that small actions can make big impacts, is a great lesson for young readers. My one big negative with the story is the reveal of the mysterious character who is not once alluded to or mentioned in passing before the reveal. It is a letdown because it is so built up in the book as an added mystery to the other ones mentioned. Other than that, this is a sweet story with good morals and some good emotional depth to show young readers that stories can move and motivate. Final grade, B+. Defenders of the West, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam by Raymond Ibrahim. Overview. Vivid and dramatic profiles of 8 extraordinary warriors who defended the Christian West against Islamic invasion. Discover the real Count Dracula, Spain's El Cid, England's Richard Lionheart, and many others, historical figures whose true and original claim to fame revolved around their defiant stance against jihadist aggression. Review. What Raymond Ibrahim has done here is reveal an accurate history of men maligned in our current day during a time in history maligned as well. I was so impressed with this work of history. Ibrahim's first and last chapters are almost as important as the 8 men covered in the book. While with his introduction, he lays everything out on the table, and especially his methodology. He is using primary sources where at all possible. He's using secondary sources at the time when needed. He's using modern interpretations only when necessary, and he's using primary sources of the same event on the other side of the conflicts to bolster his claims. This is exactly what I want to see in the historical books I want to read and learn from. Ibrahim has other works that talk about this period of Middle Age Crusaders time period in other books, but here the focus is on 8 men as follows. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the Cid, King Richard the Lionheart, Ferdinand III of Spain, Louis IX of France, John Hunyadi, Gregory Canstroni, Scanberg, and Vlad III of Romania, aka Dracula the Impaler. Using these men, Ibrahim shows that the Crusades were not the conquering colonialism against poor people. They were a response to the slaughter of hundreds and thousands of Christians in the Christian lands and in the Holy Lands by barbarous Ottomans and other Muslim groups. And the first thing that Ibrahim makes clear is just how bloodthirsty and horrific the Muslim rulers and warriors were. I will leave the book to go into the details, but this was eye-opening information that is either not discussed or hidden from most discussions. Also, the fact that these men were zealous Christians, and while Vlad III is probably the most surprising to most, I was more surprised at St. Louis IX's piety and just how quickly France fell after someone so inspiring to his people and Christian charity inspired it. Another point that stands out is how honorable and battle-tested these men were. Another amazing story is Scanderbeg, who was a janissary. I know in college I learned about this, and what was taught was not what janissaries actually were. Again, the stories of all these men were amazing to learn about. These aren't sickly kings looking upon the battlefield from afar. They're leading the charge and coming up with strategies which instill fear in their enemies. Finally, the fact that their Christian worldview informs their decisions and in how they act after battle. Wherein their enemies would do unspeakable things to Christians they ruled over, these men would rule with Christian outlooks, and freedom and liberties were afforded to civilians and foes alike. Ibrahim's final chapter really solidifies the point of what this history tells us. What it says about the men who have been slandered, the time period that has been whitewashed, and the outcomes that are still affecting us today, but have been hidden in the name of other lies. If you're into modern politics and want to read the first and last chapters, you will get a great primer in why the book was written and why it's needed. This is top-notch, well-researched, well-presented, and a fair historical book. I will definitely be checking out more from Ibrahim and learn more about these men and the times to see what else have been missing from an accurate understanding and showing that the Christian worldview really does service for the grandeur of the Western world we have enjoyed. Final grade, A. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison. Overview. A malevolent supercomputer named AM, having annihilated most of humanity, keeps the last 5 survivors alive in a post-apocalyptic world, subjecting them to endless sadistic, psychological, and physical torture, with the narrative focusing on their desperate struggles to endure the unending torment inflicted by the machine, all the while being unable to escape due to their enforced immortality. Review. What Ellison does amazingly here is takes the words of a broken and raving madman and is still able to produce weighty dialogue and reveal different aspects of the story that speak to the human condition. This is one part sci-fi and one part sociological study. The computer that takes over the world and augmented humans and post-apocalypse settings are standard goings these days, but the free-flow storytelling and from an unreliable narrator in the 1960s was very rare. While one could just call this a nihilistic tale of torture porn and ultra-violence, a second read might do one service. Figuring out what to believe from Ted's point of view uncovers different parts that lead to the conclusion of the story. One could think it as nihilism from an author who hates humanity, but like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, even the bleakest of circumstances in a story ultimately about humanity, there is hope and determination when all the odds are not in one's favor. I quite enjoyed this. Final grade, A. The Heights of Perdition by C.S. Johnson. Overview. Ares St. Cloud got into the tyrannical world's government's military academy where her estranged military father has great influence. She is captured by space pirate Exton Shepard, who doesn't know her identity or how close she is to one of the most sadly influential moments in his life. Both are mistrusting of the other, but their workings together brings them together in more ways than one. Review. I'm into my third year of reading works by C.S. Johnson, and I realize I've only done short stories from her and wanted to dig into a regular book as I've enjoyed her work quite a bit. The first book was a young adult sci-fi dystopian book that built off Ursula K. Le Guin's book, and another was a very cute slight fantasy romance. So for this year's work, I thought, why not combine them and read the first book of the Divine Space Pirates book, which is a sci-fi dystopian romance book. Let me not bury the lead. I liked the book quite a lot, and when I got to the end, I messaged the author on Twitter and stated, "How dare you? I'm glad you have other books in the series." A post-apocalyptic Earth has humanity underground, and the former U.S. is ruled by a communist regime. And other than the underground part, it's hard to see what's futuristic about it. Ares St. Cloud is from this world where all life is controlled and militaristic. Her father is a high-ranking military commander and distant from her. She has an independent streak in her, revealed further by to be an influence by her mother. Whereas many authors would probably write the character as cold and militaristic, for her heart to be unthawed, Johnson endears readers to Ares as being kind, slightly rebellious, and not completely sure of herself or her place in the world. She is captured on accident by the space pirate Exton Shepard, who captures one of the few remaining living trees on the surface and snatches Ares up in it. The biblical symbolism isn't lost here. Shepard is driven both by revenge of his father's death at the hands of General St. Cloud, and Ares hides her identity when captured, but also is driven to help those not under the heel of the government, both on his ship and the hidden caches elsewhere, to survive. Ares and Exton's romance has the enjoyable tropes of the enemies to lovers that unfolds well. Exton's sister adds a lot to the story and builds up the character of Ares even more to the reader, and the romance follows along with other elements of the story, so even us nerds who enjoy some romance in our sci-fi don't have to choose one over the other. The romance is tasteful and not explicit. While in the realm of possibility, I would have actually liked to seen the love story drawn out more, as it seems Exton's sister tends to push him into falling in love with the enemy a bit more quickly. Also, giving access to the entire ship pretty freely to the enemy was something I tended to find on a little bit more of the unbelievable side. And like a big nerd, I was actually hoping for a more political discussion, especially between the clash of the only system Ares knew versus Exton's rebellion against it. What is enjoyable is the discussion of Christianity being involved in the rebellion, with it being part of an almost monk-like sect on board. While I wouldn't place this book into a Christian fiction section entirely, it's clear the Christian influence and worldview is at play here, and it is being part of the rebellion is welcomed and realistic. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I believe it to be something that shows that Indiepub does well, writing enjoyable stories that the author wants to tell without needing the story to be in a niche category and of only for women or romance Fabio in space. While I continue the series, well, C.S. Johnson has forced me to with her ending. And that is because she has written characters and relationships well enough in a world that's interesting enough with a plot that's fun enough that made me enjoyably angry with the author. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Final grade, A-. The Revenant and the Cult, Book 1, The Trapper and the Missing Spy by Herman P. Hunter. Overview. People are vanishing in the Orem, which has a history of dark secrets and terrible kings in the ancient days. It's not any safer with the usual raiders, thieves, and dictators. Helsedrick, Herodian, and Tulfgar once again set out to protect the people of the land and see what ancient evil is at work. Review. Indiepub. This is my third year in the row of reading Hunter's work, and I'm really enjoying the sport of reading indie authors who strive just to tell good stories they want to tell. Hunter dips back into his shorter story from The Revenant and the Tomb, which I enjoyed quite a bit, which I reviewed previously. We join again the team as the main crew who have moved past their fight on the Horn of Torgiv, but whose effects seem to be popping up again. This time they are joined by a much more pleasant woodsman guide of Ro, who seems to have a familiar belief in the Allfather after an encounter with a kind man that feels familiar to Jean Valjean from Les Mis. A further unfolding of Helsedrick's backstory with being blessed with long life and wound repair from the Allfather occurs, which offers more insight in the background I liked from the first book. The elf-like character is still mysterious with a bit more of her background fleshed out, but her stealthy fighting skills are on more display here. The giant tank is also nice to see back and offers up his tank support. This book is a good start to the fuller story and is really an act one of the mystery of some cult who seems to be tied with the big bad from the first book. There is a bit less of the full story here and more of a building up of the setting and characters with a few good action scenes. Hunter shows off those action scenes well. With his first book, it was a good bit of setup before the waves of fighting that were a lot of fun to read occurred. Here, Hunter is taking his time to set up those things more. However, the main plot is a bit lighter than what I would have liked to see that would move a new reader into the next book. However, I think there is enough of the character build-up and the surprise of liking the guide Ro to wet your whistle to check out the next in the series. I appreciate Hunter's opening line about wanting to listen to the readers and return to the world of the Revenant, since it sounds like many people enjoyed it. I believe you could start with this book and use the shorter previous one as a prequel or the other way around, and it would work both ways and inform whether or not to continue in the series, which I do hope to do with the next one. Final grade, B. Drosselmeyer, Curse of the Rat King by Paul Thompson. Overview. Fritz has found himself free from his prison orphanage and is now an apprentice for one of the most powerful wizards of the Order. While being trained in the mystical arts, he can't help but to get close to the apprentices of the other wizards of the Order. The apprentices join an elite school that just so happens to harbor a dark secret and a murder committed long ago that has repercussions to the day and involves why Fritz is in the position he is now. Review. Another win for Indiepub. This is a really great premise for a book. Taking a world that can be built upon with the backdrop of the Nutcracker, Thompson establishes the magic system and magicians of that world. This being the first book of the trilogy, you can find characters that will pop up in the main story. What Thompson does is take the tropes of magic training and gives them weight. Magic is a product of one's energy that can be completed and drained. Runes and drawings shape focuses and magic use, and each magician has their own genre focus, with our main character being under the tutelage of a mage of time. On top of that, Thompson has written characters to care about. Our main character, Fritz, or Drosselmeyer, is not the chosen one, but is special, and he's also kind and focused on doing the right thing. The other magicians in training are people worth caring about, and trying to solve the mystery of who is trying to take them out matters to the reader for all of them. The quality of the writing is very well done. Building characters, adding tension, revealing clues and resolving them, and adding hints along the way shows the talent of Thompson as an author, and the care that he has for the world he is populating. This would be a hit for teenage boys and those who don't need 10 2,000-page book series to enjoy a good fantasy novel. I'm excited to read the next two. Final grade, A. Hidden Fury by Bjorn Hasseler. Overview. When a decapitated body turns up at a little library, there's more than a story to tell. Special Agent Tiffany Watson of FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit catches the case when the local PD reaches out for assistance. But all is not as it seems, as evidence, unbelievably, points towards a supernatural culprit. Review. Another in the indie pubs. This was my first encounter with the Systemata Paradoxa series, and I liked the premise. A mystery involving some type of cryptid. Just throw a cryptid in there and I'm interested. For Hasseler's entry volume, a modern-day encounter with Goatman, a murderer. Tiffany Watson is an FBI profiler who just is Normal. Finally. No childhood trauma that would remove a person from the force in a real world. No man-hating freakouts for no reason. No above superhuman intellect where she's smarter than everyone else, and an accurate take on what a profiler would do. She's a very likable character who finds a couple of local officers to tag along with into the investigation of a couple of decapitations, and a prime suspect is maybe the fabled Goat Man. A quick read, and because it is well written and enjoyable, that makes me want to check out the rest of the series by other authors. The lead up to the conclusion happens a bit quickly, and I doubt an FBI profiler is going to have an AR-15 in her vehicle as SOP gear, but that's kind of a nitpick. The conclusion was something I quite enjoyed, with maybe one or two issues of why something happened, but they are small. The take on Goatman is well done, and nice nods to recognizing that Watson is essentially in an X-Files story adds even more realism. I enjoyed my read and would recommend at least this one, and maybe the series, for my friends who enjoy cryptid stories. But who doesn't? Final grade, B+. The Kingdom of Kane by Jenny Phillips. Overview. Prince Eric is a young man who believes power and material things should bring him happiness, and cannot understand why he is so miserable. He sets on a journey to figure out why his kingdom is called the Kingdom of Kane, when no one seems to be kind at all. Most of all, him. Review. After reading and enjoying Timothy and the 10th Floor, my daughter and I were excited to read more from the author. This book continues the dual reading for both parents and kids, and the standard cliffhanger chapter endings are fun. While the setup for a story with good themes are there, the execution of the story is a bit choppy and drawn out. Prince Eric offers a main character for some major character growth. However, his major character change occurs too quickly and too perfectly. The addition and mentions to God as a motivating factor is not really tied in the story or to the growth. The Paragon character that helps Prince Eric out says God is important, but there seems to be the glancing words and that's it. The secret keys of change are good moral undertakings, but not explicitly tied to any particular worldview that would inform how to carry them out or why. After Prince Eric's change, the second part of the story is very much drawn out and at times repetitive. The ending was not well liked by either me or my daughter, as it did complete the story, but not in a way that was really satisfying. Not a bad story, but any means not a favorite one. Final grade, C-. Mist and Moonbeams, Stories from the Great Lakes Edge by Paul Michael Peters. Overview. This is the summary from the book quoted. Dive into the mysterious allure of Mist and Moonbeam, Stories from the Great Lakes Edge, a captivating collection of 5 short stories that traverse the heart and soul of the Great Lakes region. Each tale is a testament to the power of human emotion, the depth of the human heart, and the indomitable spirit of adventure that lies within us all. Review. An Indiepub for this one. With a pretentious description like, each tale is a testament to the power of human emotion, the depths of the human heart, and the indomitable spirit of the adventure that lies within us all. I wasn't expecting a whole lot, but luring me in with tales from my home state, the Great Lakes, I thought I'd give it a chance. I did not enjoy any of these stories, and while I liked the mention of towns and areas around the lakes, the stories were just not something I enjoyed nor found the message of value. For example, the initial story starts out with a mild sex scene and one rooted in infidelity. I thought the story was going the route of a Hitchcockian comeuppance, where her journey to find her lost wedding ring was going to be a symbolic journey that would lead to her getting away with it barely or failing to understand the cosmic justice had against her. Instead, we find out that her husband is just a good man, and she has no reason to do what she's doing. There's nothing given. There was an instance where her son, through meeting a girl with a pet raven, finds his mother's ring and realizes it has no response to the revelation other than a sentence or two of, "Wait, what?" And the husband knew all along and was fine with it because he promised when they got married to be with her through it all. What utter garbage. No repercussions, no real characterizations, no real responses of any value, and worst of all, nothing to be redeemed. The other stories are flat, including a conspiracy detective story that takes place somewhere in Chicago and somewhat in the Kalamazoo, WMU area. You know, there are big cities on the Lake Michigan side of Michigan that you can set your story in. This was another story where nothing really realistic happens, including a super secret senator showing up while his hitman is in the process of taking out a witness only to get away because the senator showed up and told the hitman to get the job done. The other 3 stories didn't offer much more for discussion. Really a disappointment for the stories, and the utilization of the Great Lakes could have been better utilized. Final grade, F.